The United States government granted permission for 10 of China's leading tech giants, including Alibaba, ByteDance, Lenovo, and others, to acquire NVIDIA's most advanced AI chip authorized for export, the H200. This approval was officially issued back in January, meaning it has remained valid for 5 months. Yet, astonishingly, not a single unit has been dispatched so far. Jensen Huang personally traveled to Beijing alongside the President of the United States. They shared meals, exchanged smiles, and sat in the iconic Great Hall of the People. Still, China has yet to place a single order. This, in essence, encapsulates the entire narrative of the summit. The U.S. arrived with a virtual shopping cart overflowing with deals it eagerly sought to close, and China responded with a polite, drawn-out, "We will consider it." To understand the underlying dynamics between these two nations, beyond the handshakes and ceremonial state banquets, you need to look at the numbers, because they reveal where leverage truly resides and what it implies for the financial system you navigate daily. Consider the chip situation first, as it provides the clearest insight. 10 of China's top technology corporations each hold valid U.S. licenses to purchase up to 75,000 H200 chips. This represents a potential market worth tens of billions of dollars. NVIDIA's CEO made the journey personally, collected by the president in Alaska en route to Beijing, a detail that is far from casual. The symbolic weight of the highest profile U.S. tech leader crossing continents with presidential accompaniment was intended to push the deal over the finish line. It did not succeed. Sources familiar with the matter report that Beijing quietly instructed its companies to pause, not to outright refuse, but to hold off. Sometimes a waiting tactic is costlier for the other side than an outright denial. For NVIDIA, it means sitting on certified-to-ship inventory, having structured export compliance systems around this approval, and having flown the CEO to China only for customers to remain unreachable. This is not about technical limitations. The H200 chip has not been restricted by China. Chinese firms are fully capable of deploying it. The hesitation reflects a strategic calculation by Beijing. Each chip purchased would effectively endorse American export control as a viable geopolitical instrument. China refuses to validate this model. Huawei continues developing its own AI chips. Alibaba advances its internal silicon programs, and ByteDance is actively progressing. Acquiring H200s now would lessen the urgency for domestic alternatives, but Beijing is playing a far longer game than any single summit could dictate. For investors, the implications are significant. NVIDIA's stock is priced for substantial growth, much of which hinges on China reopening as a market. The AI chip market in China is estimated at around $50 billion annually. NVIDIA once captured a notable share, but today holds almost none. Despite presidential-level engagement, CEO photo opportunities, and fully approved licenses, this status has not changed. Market optimism built around anticipated chip deals surged before the summit and collapsed afterward, reflecting the gap between expectation and reality. The cycle of hope, disappointment, and correction is particularly relevant for anyone holding exposure to technology sectors. At first glance, one might expect Boeing's transactions to steal the spotlight. Yet, the unfolding chip narrative is the true lens through which to view leverage in the U.S. China relationship. Every paused order, every unshipped chip, signals that the strategic balance is shifting subtly. America may have brought a shopping cart of opportunities, but China has chosen patience over immediate engagement, reshaping both commercial and geopolitical expectations. 200 planes, massive orders, American jobs, and a revival in manufacturing. That was the banner headline as Trump boarded Air Force One. On the surface, it sounded impressive. The last major Chinese Boeing purchase occurred during Trump's first term, when 300 planes were ordered back in 2017. Since that time, China has essentially ceased acquiring Boeing aircraft, so 200 planes seemed like a potential return to form. Yet Boeing's stock fell by 4% immediately after the announcement. Analysts tasked with forecasting future cash flows scrutinized the deal and concluded it lacked full credibility, and they were justified in their caution. Headlines often miss critical details. First, the 200 planes are less than half of the 500 units the market had expected before the summit. Second, there is no official confirmation from either Boeing or any Chinese government entity. While Trump made the public announcement, Beijing has remained silent, a gap that carries weight. The third issue is structural. China has invested heavily in developing COMAC, its domestic aircraft manufacturer. The C919 jet is now operating within the country, and the decade-long strategy aims to eliminate reliance on both Boeing and Airbus entirely. Expecting Beijing to sharply increase Boeing purchases effectively asks them to entrench the very dependency they are strategically phasing out. If confirmed, 200 planes would reflect political concessions to the United States, rather than a fundamental shift in China's aviation ambitions. A clearer picture of underlying dynamics emerged in a less publicized summit conversation. Trump raised the topic of visa, not the travel document, but the global payments network. At the meeting with China's leader, he highlighted that Visa has been effectively barred from functioning in the domestic Chinese market. He suggested the possibility of change, though such an outcome seems unlikely. Understanding the rationale reveals more about the future of finance than either the chip or Boeing deals. China's domestic payment ecosystem revolves around Alipay and WeChat Pay, which together manage over 90% of mobile transactions inside the country. UnionPay dominates most card-based activity. Meanwhile, MasterCard only received authorization to process domestic yuan payments in 2023 through a joint venture with a government-affiliated clearinghouse after more than 2 decades of attempts. American Express achieved a similar arrangement in 2020. Visa remains without a license. Beijing's caution is deliberate, not obstinate. Russia's experience in 2022 provided a clear lesson. Within days of the invasion of Ukraine, Visa and MasterCard suspended Russian operations. A single directive from the U.S. Treasury left hundreds of millions of Russian consumers without card-based access overnight. China observed this closely and is determined to prevent a repeat scenario. Its consumer economy, among the most cashless and digitally integrated in the world, will not operate on infrastructure controlled by the United States. The Chinese cross-border interbank payment system now handles more than 40 trillion yuan per quarter. This is no accident. The infrastructure was purposefully built after observing Russia, ensuring the country retains control over its digital financial operations. On a broader scale, about 30% of China's trade is now conducted in yuan, up from 14% in 2019 and less than 1% in 2010. Beijing has also signed bilateral currency swap agreements with 32 central banks globally, reinforcing a long-term strategy of financial sovereignty. Analysts at Goldman Sachs have highlighted that the yuan may be undervalued against the US dollar by roughly 20%. Despite trade tensions intensifying, the yuan has been steadily gaining strength rather than collapsing. Countries holding yuan swap agreements can now purchase Chinese goods at costs that become cheaper in yuan terms, a cycle that reinforces itself. And this trajectory is unlikely to be derailed by a summit that produced only a vague Boeing promise. This is not to suggest that China has triumphed or that the dollar's dominance is over. Currently, the yuan accounts for approximately 2.1% of global foreign exchange reserves, far behind the dollar's commanding share. China's capital controls still restrict how freely international investors can hold yuan-denominated assets. Yet the trend is unmistakable, and the summit made it even more apparent. The United States arrived in China seeking Boeing sales, chip purchases, food imports, financial market access, and entry into the payment system. China offered symbolic concessions while systematically building every alternative it requires. It may sound abstract, swap lines, payment rails, and yuan appreciation, but the implications are very tangible. For an American holding a retirement account, the companies within that portfolio are increasingly tied to China, whether as customers or suppliers. A China that delays chip orders directly impacts NVIDIA's growth. A China developing its own aircraft influences Boeing's backlog. A China that blocks Visa affects financial sector earnings. These are not mere geopolitical concepts. They are real line items on corporate balance sheets, flowing straight into the funds that most Americans own. Stories like this one are critical because mainstream financial media often reports the headlines, 200 Boeing planes, chip deal approved, without including the vital second paragraph. That is where the substantive insight resides. Understanding this kind of detail equips investors to read the second paragraph on their own, building financial literacy and awareness. So, what does this mean for the present moment? The Trump summit delivered stabilization, not transformation. The trade truce with South Korea from last October remains intact. Tariffs have not escalated this week. Another meeting is scheduled for September, but the structural questions remain unresolved. Chip orders are absent, Boeing orders unconfirmed, Visa still lacks a license, and food purchases remain vague. The hard negotiations, as one analyst noted, have been deferred until later in the year. Later in the year is significant. That is when the trade truce expires. That is when U.S. investigations into Chinese trade practices could result in new tariffs. That is when whatever Trump and Xi privately agreed to will either be implemented or quietly fade away. The real indicator is what China actually purchases, not what anyone announces publicly. Watch whether H-200 shipments commence. Watch whether Boeing secures formal order confirmations from Chinese state carriers. Monitor whether the yuan continues its appreciation against the US dollar as the currency's share of global trade settlements rises. These metrics reveal far more than press conferences ever will. This discussion leads directly into the next episode, because control over global payment infrastructure, whether through dollar networks or yuan rails, extends far beyond Beijing's airports. It affects every oil contract, every bond issuance, and every central bank reserve decision being made today across the developing world. The cumulative effect of these decisions represents one of the most consequential financial shifts of our lifetime, shaping markets' influence and power on a global scale. Stay informed. Watch the numbers. Track the real movements behind the headlines. This is where the future of global finance is being written. Please leave your thoughts about this content in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.